Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure now to invite Mr. Milinda Moragoda, founder of Pathfinder Foundation and former Cabinet Minister of Sri Lanka, to deliver his address on how a cycle of disruption is causing the implosion of South Asian Patrician politics. Mr. Moragoda, please.
Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, I would like to start and begin by thanking you for granting me this privilege, as well as for all the guidance and support and leadership you have provided in the collaboration between ISIS and Pathfinder Foundation. Ambassador Shankar Menon, of course, my good friend, it's great to see you here. And Professor Rajamohan, who it seems we have met once again because we dealt closely with each other when he was head of Carnegie India. And today, also now we deal with him as part of a new partnership between Pathfinder and ISIS. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before I begin, I just would like to get a fix on my audience. How many of you are Singaporeans here, if I may ask? Okay. And how many South Asians, if you will? And out of a sense of patriotism, how many Sri Lankans? Okay, there are fewer. Great. When I was invited to speak here, I was asked to provide an abstract of my speech and also a title for the speech. And the title I sent across was the following: A Practitioner's Perspective from the Raj to WhatsApp and the Ramayana, How a Cycle of Disruption is Causing the Implosion of South Asian Patrician Politics. The organizers came back to me and said the title was too long. So we went through a process and cut it down to How a Cycle of Disruption is Causing the Implosion of South Asian Patrician Politics. But I would like to start with my original title as a segue into this discussion. A practitioner's perspective. I am a practitioner. Many of you here are academics, and therefore sometimes it's very dangerous to have dilettantes like me speaking on essentially conceptual subjects such as what you are dealing with, especially when it comes to disruption, because my discussion today, my speech today will be on disruption. Most academic works I have read on disruption warn you that disruption should not be abused as a word, because today everybody is talking about disruption. But I am going to take the liberty as a practitioner to abuse the word, if I may be so indulged. From Raj to WhatsApp and the Ramayana, the heading, the Raj, by Raj what I mean is what the British left behind. Because as you know, the British, when they governed us, they had a structure where a few Englishmen, a few white Englishmen, were able to govern very large extents and areas. I think Singapore, Malaysia, you have all experienced that. And then you had an administrative system, which I think Mr. Menon probably is more familiar with than I am. I think it was called the Iron Frame, I believe. That was a structure which actually administered our states. Once the British left, we had a class of our own which was created, more comfortable in London probably than elsewhere, and who replaced them, and that was the governing structure. So that is the Raj I refer to in the context of my title. Then to WhatsApp and the Ramayana. The WhatsApp basically deals with the social media and the disruption that is taking place through that today in the South Asian region and of course beyond. And I chose WhatsApp because Facebook, as you know, Twitter, Instagram, everything is there. But WhatsApp seems to have a particular resonance in places like Sri Lanka, I find. To the extent that I believe that today you can only put up 5 WhatsApp messages at the same time in Sri Lanka because they don't want too many people sending out messages. Ramayana represents the rise of patriotism, this new symbol. Why did I choose the Ramayana? Why not the Mahabharata? Ramayana is relevant, for example, in India and in Sri Lanka. For example, Ravana was the king of Lanka. And he took many of our more hardline elements. Ravana represents a symbol. Ramayana, Rama is a symbol of, obviously, in India. So this is the swing that is taking place as I see it, and I will discuss that in further depth. And then what it is causing is what I suggest is an implosion of the old South Asian Patrician politics. But we are at a very early stage in this process. And before I enter our region, I would like to start from outside, because I think what is happening outside is going to have a huge impact on us in the coming years. In the global context, disruption today means it takes place at many different levels. In the extreme sense, it is terrorism. A small group of insurgents in Yemen can today affect our oil prices in Singapore, in Colombo, in New York, just by using drone technology. A group of extremists in Sri Lanka can be empowered through the dark web and through other means and inspired to go and conduct the dastardly and horrible acts they committed on Easter Sunday this year. So that is the extreme end of the spectrum. Then you have the commercial and the business disruptions that are taking place, which I think Singapore is very much aware of and very much ahead of the curve on. Whether it's Uber or whether it's Airbnb or whether it's Netflix or Google or Amazon or Facebook, this is all disruption. The world as we know it is changing. Today, recently when I was walking down Orchard Road, I saw Beyond Meat. Now there is talk that meat will become obsolete and we will have this artificial meat that is going to be served for us. Then driverless cars, I think Singapore is pioneering that. So that is the commercial disruption that is taking place, and that is taking place very fast. Sadly, as a politician, we are way behind the times. Political institutions, governing institutions, governance is way behind the times. You see this today, for example, if you look at what is happening in the British Parliament. You have basically the Middle Ages meeting the modern world in a way, in a very strange way. All of us were coached in Erskine May when we joined Parliament. The first book I got was Erskine May. Baron Erskine May probably would have hung his head in shame when he saw what happened in the British Parliament recently. Equally, it gave us an opportunity to gloat, because very often it is countries like ours that are held up as having our own approach to parliamentary culture. So politics, in my view, is way behind what is happening. And hence the rise of what I call the disruptors in politics. And I'm going to start from outside South Asia and work my way in, if I may. When I was studying in the United States, in the East Coast, in Boston, there is a place called Beacon Hill. Many of you who are probably familiar. The Boston Brahmins from Beacon Hill were the elite of America. And foreign policy, thinking, governance, everything emerged from this network. Then came Wall Street, then came Silicon Valley, and the states in between were known as the flyover states by many people, because you flew over them to get to the West Coast. Well, in the United States now, the flyover states have struck back. Donald Trump is a disruptor, and it is a case of the fact that a certain class was ignored and they are striking back. And I remember the Sackler family in the US, many of you would be familiar with them. They were great philanthropists, contributing to the Smithsonian, to institutions like Harvard. Today, the family is almost, basically they have been accused of being involved in the whole opioid business. So the traditional the class structure is being turned head over heels in the United States. This is not only Donald Trump, you see it on the other side. You see it with the Democratic Party, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or whether it's Kamala Harris. Everybody is challenging the norm. So to me, that is what disruption is about. Cross the Atlantic and we have Brexit. Doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know whether it makes sense to you. But clearly, a fair number of people in the United Kingdom felt left out. And they reacted. Irrationally so, maybe, they reacted. In France, interesting experiment. You have President Macron coming up, trying to cut through, breaking and pushing aside the traditional political forces of France. And you have him held hostage sometimes by a group of yellow-jacketed people, basically disrupting the country. But an interesting experiment. Whether Macron succeeds or not to be is an interesting political experiment to watch. Then you have other countries. We can talk of Brazil, we can talk of even Vladimir Putin, we can talk of Mr. Xi Jinping, we can talk of Mr. Abe. They all are trying to disrupt in their own way because the populations of these countries are looking for something different. Because there is a feeling that globalization only benefited some people and not others. Then now we come to South Asia. A population of 1.4 billion people. 70 years since independence has been governed only by a few political dynasties. I think that has to change. That is the reality. So disruption has begun in South Asia. And I say begun because I think we need to watch where that will lead. We have Prime Minister Modi, we have Prime Minister Imran Khan. In different ways, they are disruptors. In Sri Lanka, it is more complicated, but we have several disruptors. We can talk more about it. I think Dr. Vidanage is going to speak on Sri Lanka, so I will let him do the discussion on that. But if you have any questions, we can discuss it during the question and answer session. But these are all disruptors. Now, South Asia, with its ancient civilizations, religions, and going back thousands of years, is complicated, and we should not try to make South Asia a monolith, which is very dangerous to do. Little Sri Lanka is as unique as all the other regions and countries are, so one has to look at South Asia in a disaggregated form when we look at these issues. But the fact is, when the British left South Asia, many of our countries, in the hands of an elite who basically, many of them were educated in Oxford or Cambridge or the London School of Economics, depending on your disposition. They came back with ideas, and they thought like the British, had British vision, and I think meant well. That's what we must understand, meant well. And that experiment is what has been going forward since independence for the past 70 years. Now, as the economies grew, the ruling class, in my view, became increasingly separated from the population at large, because you had a middle class rising, a more vernacular middle class, a middle class comfortable, let's say in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, as opposed to Shakespeare or Dickens, and a more self-confident middle class who were much more confident in their own capacities. And they began to challenge the elite, the Patrician elite, as I call it. The Patrician elite, unfortunately, have not learned to adjust. So they are still comfortable in their old schools. Now in Sri Lanka, if you look at it, the elite go to the public school model that existed in India, in the United Kingdom, exists in Sri Lanka as well. So very often they say that the Battle of Britain was won on the playing fields of Eton. In Sri Lanka, very often, the political game was played in the playing fields of Royal or St. Thomas's, which were the main schools. So that culture, the elite were not able to understand that this new middle class was coming up, this new vernacular middle class was coming up, and as a result, this polarization continued to grow. I think in India, and there are others I would defer to on this, there was a similar development in a different way, and that has led to the disruption that we are seeing now. Now, the danger in this disruption is in all societies like ours, we have many fault lines across. It's not only race, we have caste, which is something unusual. Now in India, caste is talked about. In Sri Lanka, strangely, we don't talk about it, but we have it. So those fault lines are there in the case of caste, class, and religion, and ethnicity, of course. And the disruption that is taking place, if one is seeking to get your alignment right in a democratic context, by aligning one group against another, it can lead to maybe not the best result. But that is what is happening in South Asia as I see it. We are aligning, we are creating new fault lines to basically to ensure that we correct what we see as earlier mistakes. So this class fault line, which is there now between a more anglicized elite and a more vernacular middle class that is emerging, and an underclass that feels that they have not benefited from the democratic process as well as from the economic development process, this polarization is emerging. And politicians have to deal with this if they are to work within a democratic framework. So it is very easy to move towards populism. It is very easy to move towards demagoguery. It is very easy to have divisive politics, because it is a default position. Because if it's happening in the West, there is no reason why it should not happen elsewhere either. So I think we are having this discussion at it's a timely discussion, because South Asia has not gone there yet, but it has to change. The Patrician middle class, the Patrician upper class, who tend to be more comfortable in Davos than probably in Delhi, need to start changing the way they think. And if you look at Sri Lanka, language is a major fault line. Sinhala, which is the language of the majority, is seen, as I have mentioned even in my abstract, is seen in the universities as a sword that cuts part of society out of the mainstream. Because English is the language, international language, but the majority in Sri Lanka speak Sinhala. So this has created a huge fault line, which is also leading to many the disruptions in politics. So I often refer to this as democracy with South Asian characteristics, the reason being the fact that democracy is the safety valve that has kept us going so far. But in countries like Sri Lanka, we have seen huge amounts of violence, immense violence, despite democracy being there as a safety valve. What you hear internationally, or what is given prominence internationally, is to the ethnic violence in Sri Lanka. But we have had other types of violence as well in our country, where our youth, our Sinhala youth, have rebelled from time to time. And sometimes in my columns in the newspapers, I have said that every 15 years, we cull our youth in order to make sure that our upper classes can continue to go on the journey that they are going at the moment. And it's a harsh way of putting it, but there is some truth to that. So therefore, I think there has to be a transformation, but the transformation has to be on a middle path. I am a Buddhist, and as a Buddhist, the middle path is what has to work. So the risk of extremism in South Asia is great. It requires leaders on both sides, on the part of the patrician middle class, upper classes, and the political leaderships, to start looking for the middle path. And I'm not sure how and when we will get about it, because the reason is that the patrician middle classes, upper classes were also supported by oligarchic networks of media, of commerce, and even the academic community. And the disruption to this is coming through the social media. So social media can weaponize nationalism and divisiveness in a very dangerous way. So social media should not be the only answer to this process. There has to be other dialogues, other discussions. But unfortunately, sometimes I find that our societies are too polarized. In the context of the future, I would like to be optimistic. If in when it comes to South Asia, we have not only, as far as the Western value system is concerned, not only have we imbibed from Western values, but we have also been able to give to the West. Any country you go in, any capital you visit in the world today, you will see South Asian influences. You will also see South Asian leaders coming up. You look at the British cabinet, you look at the American political system, Canada, you see many, and even Germany, I believe, there are South Asian politicians who are very active. And I think that is a good thing, because we will hopefully be able to work better with the diasporas. I noticed Mr. Modi is visiting Houston, and there is going to be, I think, a very interesting meeting there. This kind of dialogue and osmosis, if you will, I think is extremely important for us to see the positives. Recently, I interviewed the Archbishop of Canterbury for my television program, and I asked him, because as you know, Anglicanism is the symbol of empire as far as the British were concerned. And I asked him, has Anglicanism moved beyond empire? Because there are 85 million Anglicans around the world. And his answer to me was interesting. He said that today, the average Anglican is a woman most likely living in sub-Saharan Africa, earning less than $4 a day. So that means Anglicanism has now been taken over by the colonized in a way. So the whole picture is turning. So what would a South Asian, the ideal South Asian individual, what should he or she be like for the future? I think we should be secure in our own identity, our languages, our culture. and our religions. But self-confident and unafraid enough to engage the outside world. Because I think a lot of our issues are coming with a sense of insecurity that we have within ourselves. So if we become more confident, more self-confident, then I think we should be able to engage better with the outside world. And I think this is like, I guess, thinking globally and acting locally. It's a much hackneyed phrase, but I think that is what it should be. But what should the politicians who are disruptors be careful of? Because that is very important. That applies to all our politicians in South Asia. I think for that I have a quotation from a very unusual source. There is a hedge fund manager and a financier called Pierre Lagrange. I don't know whether any of you have heard of him. He's a niche private equity player. He recently bought a tailoring shop in Savile Row called Huntsman. It is based on that shop that you have the Kingsman movies, the two movies that came out of Hollywood. And he has now made the double-breasted suit fashionable again internationally and with young people. And he was asked about, what have you done? How did you do this? He said, what I have done is I have done disruption with respect. And I think that is what is important for all of us in our region. Disruption, but with respect. But I would be not doing my duty if I were not to conclude today's presentation without referring to me, to whom I believe is one of the greatest disruptors of all, and a man I respect a lot. And he is none other than the giant who founded this nation, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. I think if he had not done what he did, and he wanted to make money and create wealth, he would have probably created an Amazon or a Google. Instead, he decided to build a nation. And I will end with two quotations from him, because I think that would summarize my own thinking as well. The first quotation is what he said was, I was a product of the times. The war, the occupation, the reoccupation, my 4 years in Britain, admiring, but at the same time questioning whether they are able to do a better job than we can. And I think that is the most important thing. If somebody else can do a better job than we can, learn from them. There is no point us going and insisting that we can do a better job. And his other quotation was, I always tried to be correct, but not politically correct. And that is spoken like a true disruptor indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Moragoda. It is my pleasure now to invite Professor Tan Tai Yong, President, Yale-NUS College, and Deputy Chairman at ISAS, to join Mr. Moragoda on stage for the question and answer session. I will now hand over the floor to Professor Tan.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm sure you enjoyed as much as I have this very wonderful broad picture treatment of disruptions and its impact not only in the world, but on South Asia as a region and individual countries within South Asia, and what likely outcomes it's supposed to have, and also the kinds of disruption with respect that we would hope to see happening in the world today. So I'm not going to spend too much time summarizing the speech, but I would like now to open the floor to questions. Now we have about 20 minutes, so I need to keep time because otherwise the rest of the program today might be disrupted. So perhaps I can start by taking, if you allow, 3 questions at a go, and then I'll ask Mr. Moragoda to address them collectively, and then we'll see how it flows from there. So maybe the first set of questions, any takers?
Thank you, Minister. Very interesting expose. My name is Iftikhar Chaudhary. I'm from ISAS, originally Bangladesh. I was very interested in the way you describe disruptors. But what is the difference between the disruptors that you talk of, or the disruptors that Thomas Carlyle spoke of, for instance? I mean, almost everyone he mentioned was a disruptor of the age. Alexander was a disruptor, Christ was a disruptor, Muhammad was a disruptor. So what's the difference between the disruptor of those days and the contemporary disruptors? Because you have to disrupt in order to recreate, right? And out of the chaos is born the dancing star. Secondly, you made one point about when you said you wanted to speak desegregated South Asia. What, in your view, is we should focus on South Asia? Is it our commonalities, or is it our distinctiveness? If we stress the commonalities too much, there is no reason for the separate sovereign entities in South Asia. And if we stress the distinctiveness too much, we cannot view the South Asia as some kind of a composite whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Ifti. I'll just take, say, the next question, and then the third one, and then we'll pause for the Minister to answer. One right at the back, and then person in front.
My name is Sunil. I live in Singapore, ethnically an Indian. Using religion for disruption. I'd like to hear your comments with respect to what is happening in India. Coming to power with disruption through religion.
Okay. Third one.
Yeah, my name is Nilanjan Bhaumi. You were talking about disruptors. One of the biggest disruption that is happening, I would say it is on the economic front. That's the corporate world. You know, if you look at companies like Google, Facebook, and not just these IT companies, even large multinationals across the world, you know, they are kind of creating global citizens. Whether you are from Sri Lanka, India, XYZ countries, we all belong to that corporate world, because that is the kind of life that we are talking about. You know, like I will maybe coin a word called weird, you know, W-E-I-R-D. So we are all westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and liberal. That is the kind of life that we are talking about. We all try to emulate that life. If you look at everybody, all of us, all are westernized as far as race is concerned. We speak a language which is a global language, and most of us have a thinking of in a similar line. I think that is the biggest disruption that is happening globally in each and every country. And all these local, regional, language, religion, I think it will all become redundant. What's your view on this? Thank you.
The word that you spell out nearly spelled weird.
Weird. Yeah, weird.
Okay.
Yeah, weird.
So if you use disrupted as the last letter, then it's actually weird, but maybe it's not so weird after all. Okay, I'll ask the Minister to answer. So the first question, if I could remind you, is what's the difference between historical disruptions and current disruptors? And also then the second part is, how do you see South Asia as a region, as distinct states, and how do each state create its own identity yet share some commonality? So that's the first question. I'll let you answer that first.
The answer to your first question is probably not between Alexander the Great, Lee Kuan Yew, and whoever we are talking about now. But I think we each live in our times, and technology has probably, as the minister herself said in the morning, I mean, has created an immediacy to everything. So the speed at which everything is happening is much greater, and therefore I think the time to reflect, to think is less. And if that I see as being the difference, because technology has sort of weaponized some of these things, and there is good in that and bad in it. But as it comes to personalities, probably not. I would not argue with you on that. Are we going to look for commonalities, differences? I mean, as a Sri Lankan, because India's perspective, that maybe we can ask Mr. Menon better than me, but as a Sri Lankan, I would think we should look for commonalities, because we need to have more people-to-people contact, more connectivity in the region. It is a very poorly connected region. And of course, the India-Pakistan issue always becomes a sort of a overlying issue for the smaller countries in the area. But what we should look for is connectivity. That's what smaller countries, I think as a small country in the region, I would say, and look at more finding what we have in common, understanding our histories more. I sometimes feel that we should teach Indian history in our schools, because our conditioning, and again here as a politician I may be overgeneralizing, but I say that we as Sinhalese sometimes have a sort of a Ramayana complex, because we look at India as a threat rather than an opportunity. Because in the Ramayana, King Ravana was our king, and Rama came and killed our king. And the son of Ravana, Vibhishana, he left to look after Sri Lanka and left. I'm oversimplifying the whole epic, of course, but we have that complex, a fear of India. So what I always advocate is look for what we have in common and try to understand that. And I hope that answers your question.
The second question is about using religion as a disruption and citing the case of India.
No, it is not only India, it is dangerous. There is no question about it. And my question is, where do we go from here now? Because I see the fault line of, let's say, this Patrician upper class versus the rest. In order to consolidate the rest, if you use religion, as it is happening in many countries in the region, that is dangerous. I think there has to be a dialogue on that. And there, I think the English-speaking, the more westernized upper classes have to be much more flexible, much more open-minded, and try to understand their own people before they try to understand everything else. This is because in my country, I see it as being a very dangerous development, where there is this polarization between a small group of westernized upper classes and the rest of the country, and the Western world also identifying more with the westernized upper class, and thereby creating further polarization. So, I mean, the answer to your question is very straightforward. Religion should not be used. It is being used, it should not be used.
And the third question is the more fundamental phenomenon of the corporate world, technology, disrupting the way we identify ourselves, and maybe the identification is global citizens rather than as members of states or nations. What's your thought on that?
My sense is this is more the Davos concept, and I have the feeling maybe what you are talking about may happen in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, I don't know, I can't speak to that. But the world I will live in and probably you will live in will be defined by our identities. Identity politics will be relevant. And I think if you try to fight that, we are going to create a pushback, a blowback, similar to what we are seeing now. So I think both sides have to understand each other. Global citizens, I think you obviously are one of them, who think that way, have to try to understand a bit more as to what people who are not benefiting from this system are thinking. Because a majority of people in South Asia, and not even in South Asia, I would say even in Southeast Asia, are not benefiting from this system. The polarization in wealth that globalization has created and the pushback against that is, in a way, we are throwing the baby and the bathwater out. That's the direction in which we are going now. And when it comes to the international trade environment, the international investment environment, I think all that is going to suffer with this blowback that is coming. So what you are saying may be the final objective. I am not sure whether that is the most desirable objective. That I think should be subject to a different discussion, because I believe that culture, religion, identity is extremely important. Language, I believe, is extremely important. And of course, we need linked languages. English is a linked language. Chinese could become a linked language. Hindi could become a linked language. But that should be in addition to whatever language we think in, we dream in In Sri Lanka, always people ask you, what language do you dream in? Because that is the definition of your identity. And many people dream in English. They say, oh, that man dreams in English, so he doesn't understand my dreams. So that will continue, I think, until disparities exist in this world, and disparities will continue to exist. So I'm not exactly where you are, but I think we have to get to some middle path on that.
Thank you. Can we have the next set of questions? Yes, there's a lady at the back there. Can you pass the mic? Yeah, you see her hand there?
Thank you. My name is Anuradha Rao. I'm an independent researcher and consultant. In my conversations with Sri Lankans, both in Sri Lanka and in Singapore, in their 30s and 40s, there's basically this deep sense of disillusionment and increasing disconnect between them and politicians and the political system in Sri Lanka. And I just wanted to get your take on how can there be a disruption within the political system to make it more connected to the youth of today, to feel that their aspirations for a modern, vibrant Sri Lanka are finally sort of put into policy making. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. A second question? Okay, if not, then I'll ask Milinda to answer this, because this is an important question. How do you create enough disruption such that the established order generates a better sense of connection with young people whose aspirations, whose worldviews are very different from theirs or from their predecessors? And I think this is something that's not unique to Sri Lanka, but across the world, and in its most extreme form, we're seeing things happening in Hong Kong. So,
I think Sri Lanka in particular, it is complicated. I mean, I feel personally that what I refer to as the Patrician classes of Sri Lanka, they were well-meaning in what they tried to do since independence, but I think they let our youth down. And the youth, if you look at it, since 1948 to now, we have lost thousands of Sinhala youth to rebellions and insurrections. We have lost Tamil youth, and I hope we are not now coming into a situation we are going to lose, that we will lose Muslim youth. So something has gone wrong. We can analyze it. I think in Sri Lanka, among the intellectuals and the business community especially, they always cite Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, that when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew first visited Sri Lanka, they say that he had said that Singapore must emulate Sri Lanka. And apparently, towards the latter part of his period as Prime Minister, he had always referred to Sri Lanka as something a country should not be. So obviously, his disillusionment with Sri Lanka was probably similar to our youth's disillusionment with Sri Lanka. How do we connect? It's a very complicated thing, because we have, I mean, our university system, I think people like Dr. Vidhanage can probably talk on this. Our university system, our education system, our university system, we are very proud of it. We have free education. We have very intelligent youth coming out of the university system, but they are not employable in the workplace. So as a consequence, mostly all our liberal arts graduates have to be employed by the government. So today we have our population is 22 million people. We have 1.5 million people working in government. And almost every batch of liberal arts graduates are absorbed by the government, fully, whether they have jobs or not. So there is a lot of disillusionment on the part of our youth. That's at the university level. Then when it comes to ordinary young people, if you ask them what do they want to do, they will say, I want to work abroad, I want to leave the country. That seems to be the aspirational goal of any young person. We have a large number of young people working in the Middle East, mostly women, and our young men, most of them, about 1 million of them, a large number of that workforce, are driving tuk-tuks, because that is a huge business in Sri Lanka, because our public transport system doesn't really function well. So as a consequence, the tuk-tuk is the transport of the middle classes, the emerging middle classes in Sri Lanka. So if a young man feels that his future is just the mobile phone and the tuk-tuk, that's not a future for them. And if young women feel that they have no future beyond going to the Middle East, that is not a future either. So to answer your question, I think we need a huge transformation. I mean, something I feel is necessary. Our politicians have to change. If they don't change, I think we will see another ongoing insurrections in our country. Because our politicians do not want to tell the truth. They do not want to take those hard decisions. I mean, having been a politician, probably I'm also responsible for this. But they don't want to take the hard decisions and give that kind of leadership. And in fact, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew is famous for his quotation about Sri Lankan democracy. He is supposed to have said that Sri Lankan democracy is a periodic auction of non-existent resources. Typically, pithy Lee Kuan Yew quotation. But I wouldn't disagree with that. We are having an auction coming up now, and that's how it works.
Right, I think we have time for one last question, but I see two hands. So I'm going to give the mic to Chairman, and then I'll take your question as well, and they'll be the last two, and I'll ask Mr. Milinda to answer. Chairman, please.
Thank you, Tai Yong. I just wanted to clarify something. If I remember correctly, when you started, you said that Lee Kuan Yew was a disruptor who built a nation. Am I right? Perhaps I've lived here all my life, and that's been pretty long. I don't see him as a disruptor who built a nation. He's a builder. And his disruption, I would say, was minimal. If you take various aspects of his rule, for instance, the study of mother tongue, I think it's a good example of what a builder does. He carries on from what you have. And he didn't introduce another language, or he just carried on. The mother tongue was important because the reason for this was in the what do you call this in the army, when you go in for training, they were almost illiterate. They could only speak their mother tongue, but they could, you could, if you change it to English, they would have been lost. So he carried on the same thing. He said, yes, then we will teach them their mother tongue, and they can learn English. English is the language of commerce, and you learn English. This is just one example. So I will not classify him as a disruptor who builds. He's a builder. If you look at his treatment of civil servants, for instance, he came onto the scene with total contempt of the British trained civil servants, who he saw as lazy and uncreative and sort of thing. But he ended up using the civil servants and creating a cadre of civil servants who were extremely efficient, and his success, I would say, substantially due to how he used his civil servants. So I would like to suggest that he's basically a builder. Disruptions, when it is absolutely necessary, he introduces. But he cannot be, he's a conservative person. And conservatives generally like to retain as much of the past as possible. So that's my contention.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that's a comment. You want to respond to that quickly before I take the next question? You go ahead first.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't disagree with you on that. I mean, my definition of disruption in his case would be, one is that he was not happy with the status quo, and he had the courage to do what was necessary to shake it up. But I think I would define him as what I would look for in the ideal in this situation, this disruptor with respect. Whatever he does, he did with respect, respect to culture, respect to, what worked, he let it work. As you say, he was a conservative, and I think one has to be a conservative in this. What works, let it work. And what has to be changed, you should have the courage to change it. But what is happening with, I think, our politicians across the world in a way, where you are happy with the status quo and you are benefiting from the status quo, you allow it to go on. And that is the danger. So by disruption, I think I'm talking about where you are not happy with the status quo and you want to change it, and you are willing to make the changes where necessary.
So he was prepared to make changes even if the changes were unpopular.
Unpopular.
Yeah. Okay. Final question at the back, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. My name is Joy Rankodke, Sri Lankan, living abroad. My question is about what you're talking about, the coming change or the coming tsunami where things are going to be changing, and where the global system will have a profound change, where we throw away ideas of private sector, globalization, investment, where taken people from poverty. The recent comments by the Business Roundtable in the US, do you see that as, how do you see that, transposing that in South Asia? Because many of the challenges would need private sector involvement in South Asia, because South Asian countries don't have enough funds. So kind of what your broad thoughts on the role that private sector needs to play to kind of avoid some of these negative disruptions we might be looking at in the next 5 years. Thanks.
It is extremely challenging, especially for smaller countries, and I think that's one case where maybe Singapore and Sri Lanka can also cooperate, because smaller countries are going to be challenged by this system, because bigger countries will find a way out of it. I mean, the bigger countries will prefer transactional approaches, especially the US, I think, under the present president at least, seems to prefer transactional approaches. And an open regime where private investment is allowed to flow, that's what has, I suppose, got Singapore where it has got, and it's sort of helped us also to come up to some extent. So my view is, if the multilateral framework is going to, at least for the moment, I hope it's not going to be forever, going to be under threat, we have to find other mechanisms. Regional cooperation is, I think, one way, and I think having these various regional mechanisms, especially within Asia, is a good thing, because Asia is where the growth is going to be, and I think looking east, if you will, for us makes a lot of sense. Into that, of course, comes the other dimension, China, India. I mean, the competition between China and India, that's another challenge for especially small countries like ours to contend with, because you work too closely with China, that sometimes India would feel sort of, there could be issues there. So we have to find those balances, how we balance that. I think for countries like Singapore, it will be more US-China, I guess, but how you manage giants, that's going to be another art form. The role of the private sector, yes, I mean, in this age, the definitions also change. I mean, today, I think companies like Amazon, I mean, as we enter the Alibabas, the Amazons, then as the whole financial infrastructure changes, I think this paradigm shift that we are going through in every sector is going to affect how the private sector operates as well. And on one side, we have Amazon, and we have possibilities of new financial systems. And on the other side, we have this mindset where we are close to external the external trade. So these contradictions will also have to be sorted out. So I hope that we are in a transition stage now. And the question is, are we going to transcend into something better or worse is going to be the challenge, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Moragoda. I'm afraid I have to bring the session to a close. This has been a very rich discussion. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for your questions. Please join me in thanking Mr. Milinda Moragoda.
Thank you, Mr. Moragoda and Professor Tan, for an engaging session.